A dog attacks a boy at school, sending teachers and students into a frenzy. But when they check his bag, the chaos turns to pure shock. Inside, they don't just find school books. They uncover something no one expected, something that changes everything. Why did the dog target him? What's really going on behind closed doors? And most importantly, what secret has this boy been hiding all along? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The school hallway buzzed with the usual between-class energy. Students clustered in small groups, their laughter and chatter echoing off the metal lockers that lined the walls. Backpacks swung, and sneakers squeaked against the freshly waxed floor as teenagers hurried to their next classes. Mrs. Carter walked her usual route, her sensible shoes clicking steadily on the linoleum. Beside her, Loki padded along, his black and tan coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The German Shepherd moved with practiced grace, occasionally pausing to let students pat his head or to nuzzle a familiar hand. "Hey, Loki," a girl called out, and the dog's tail wagged gently in response. Mrs. Carter smiled, used to these small interactions that made the school feel more like a community. Then everything changed. Loki froze mid-step. His ears shot up and his entire body went rigid. Mrs. Carter felt the sudden tension through the leash, but before she could react, Loki's attention locked onto something ahead, or rather someone. A boy in a gray hoodie walked with his head down, weaving through the crowd. Max Parker. Mrs. Carter recognized him from her counseling roster, though he rarely spoke during their sessions. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Loki lunged forward with unexpected force, yanking the leash from Mrs. Carter's grip. The dog bounded forward and slammed into Max, knocking him to the ground. "Loki, no!" Mrs. Carter shouted, rushing forward. The hallway erupted into chaos. Students jumped back, some screaming, others pulling out their phones to record. Max lay sprawled on the floor, his backpack contents scattered across the hallway. "Get the dog!" someone yelled. Mrs. Carter reached for Loki's collar, but the usually obedient dog refused to back away from Max. He wasn't attacking. Instead, he stood over the boy, whining softly. "I'm okay, I'm fine," Max said quickly, his voice shaky as he tried to sit up. His face had gone pale, and he winced as he moved. Mr. Thompson, the math teacher, hurried over to help gather Max's spilled belongings. As he picked up the backpack, a small zippered bag fell out, its contents spilling across the floor. Gauze pads, medical tape, and several loose painkillers. The hallway went quiet. Max's eyes widened in panic. "It's not. I skateboard," he stammered, scrambling to gather the supplies. "I fall a lot. That's all." Mrs. Carter watched as Max's trembling hand stuffed everything back into his bag. She'd worked with Loki for 3 years, and the dog had never, not once, acted aggressively toward a student. "Max, if you need to talk," she started. "I'm fine," he cut her off, his voice firm despite his obvious distress. "Really, I just need to get to class." The other teachers exchanged concerned glances, but without any clear evidence of trouble, there wasn't much they could do. Max got to his feet, clutching his backpack close to his chest. Mrs. Carter finally managed to get a good grip on Loki's leash, but the dog resisted as she tried to lead him away. He kept turning his head, straining toward Max, making small whimpering sounds she'd never heard from him before. Something was definitely wrong. Mrs. Carter could feel it in her gut, and clearly Loki sensed it too. In her office, Mrs. Carter leaned closer to her computer screen, watching the hallway footage for what felt like the 100th time. Loki lay at her feet, his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes remained alert, focused on the door. I just don't understand, she murmured, clicking the replay button again. On screen, Loki's behavior transformed from calm to intensely focused in a split second. The dog's body language showed no signs of aggression. Instead, there was an urgency she'd never seen before. Mrs. Carter paused the video, zooming in on Mac's face just before the incident. Something in his expression made her stomach twist. The boy's features were carefully blank, but his eyes held a wariness that seemed out of place on a teenager. Meanwhile, Max walked quickly through his neighborhood, his shoulders hunched against the autumn wind. His ribs ached where Loki had knocked him down, but it was nothing compared to the older bruises hidden beneath his clothes. As he approached his house, his steps slowed. His stepfather's car sat in the driveway, and Mac's heart began to race. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the front door. Greg Parker sat on the leather couch, a basketball game playing on the TV. He didn't look up, but Max felt the shift in the air immediately. "The school called today," Greg said, his voice deceptively calm. "Something about a dog attack?" Mac's mother stood in the kitchen doorway, her fingers twisting her dish towel. Her eyes met Max for a moment before dropping to the floor. "It wasn't an attack," Max said carefully. "The therapy dog just got excited. That's all." Greg's jaw tightened. "And the medical supplies in your bag?" "For skateboarding," Max answered quickly. "Like I told them at school." "Right," Greg drawled, finally turning to look at Max. His eyes were cold. "Because you're so good at skateboarding?" Max edged toward the stairs. "I have homework." Greg watched him go, his expression darkening, but he didn't stop him. Not yet. In his room, Max locked the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He pulled up his shirt, examining the purple-yellow bruises that spread across his ribcage in the mirror. The new ones from Loki's tackle were barely visible compared to the older marks. His hands shook as he pulled out the painkillers he'd managed to save. He swallowed 3 dry, willing them to work quickly. The next morning, the school counseling office was quiet except for Loki's restless pacing. Mrs. Carter had tried to feed him his breakfast, but the bowl remained untouched. Instead, the German Shepherd stood by the door, his ears perked forward, waiting. When the first students began arriving, Loki's attention sharpened. His body grew tense, tail straight out behind him. The moment Max walked through the entrance, Loki's posture changed completely. He stood rigid, a low whine escaping his throat. Mrs. Carter watched her usually gentle therapy dog, a chill running down her spine. In all her years working with service animals, she'd never seen such focused, deliberate behavior. Something was very, very wrong. Mrs. Carter walked through the bustling school hallways, her usual confident stride now hampered by Loki's constant tugging. The German Shepherd kept pulling toward the east wing, where Max's classroom was located. His ears were forward, and soft whines escaped his throat every few steps. "Loki, heel," she whispered firmly, but the dog's attention remained fixed ahead. This wasn't like him at all. In 3 years of service work, he'd never ignored a direct command. As they passed the science lab, Mr. Peterson stepped out, waving a stack of papers. "Mrs. Carter, do you have a minute? I needed to discuss—" Before she could respond, Loki seized his chance. The moment she loosened her grip to take the papers, he slipped free, trotting purposefully down the hall. "Loki!" she called, but he was already pushing through the door to Mac's classroom with his nose. Inside, Ms. Wilson stopped mid-sentence about algebraic equations. The students' heads turned as Loki padded straight to Mac's desk, ignoring everyone else. He sat down beside the boy, his brown eyes fixed intently on Max's face. Ms. Wilson adjusted her glasses, clearly flustered. "Is everything all right?" Max forced a laugh, but his hands gripped the edges of his desk. "He probably smells my lunch," he joked weakly, but his voice trembled slightly. The other students whispered and pointed. Some giggled. Max's face grew red as he tried to smile, but there was fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that didn't match the situation. Ms. Wilson reached for her classroom phone. "I'll call the office." Mrs. Carter arrived moments later, slightly out of breath. "I am so sorry," she said, grabbing Loki's collar. "Come on, boy." But Loki planted his feet, refusing to move. His tail was straight out behind him, his body tense. "It's fine," Max said quickly, too quickly. "He's just being friendly, right?" Mrs. Carter noticed how the boy's shoulders hunched protectively, how his smile didn't reach his eyes. Something about his carefully casual tone felt rehearsed. It took several firm tugs to finally get Loki moving. He whined as she pulled him away, his eyes never leaving Max. Back in her office, Mrs. Carter sat at her desk, running her hands through her hair in frustration. Loki paced by the door, clearly agitated. "What are you trying to tell me?" she asked softly. The dog's strange behavior gnawed at her. She pulled out his training records, spreading them across her desk. As she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. She leaned closer, reading the highlighted section about his specialized training. "Heightened sensitivity to emotional distress markers," she read aloud. "Ability to detect signs of suppressed trauma through behavioral and physiological cues." Mrs. Carter's hand trembled slightly as she turned the page. Loki wasn't being difficult or aggressive. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do, identifying someone in serious emotional distress, even when they were trying to hide it. She looked at Loki, who had finally settled but kept his eyes on the door. He wasn't acting randomly at all. He knew something that everyone else had missed. Max's heart pounded as he walked toward Mrs. Carter's office. The secretary had pulled him from history class with a pink slip, and now his palms were sweating. He wiped them on his jeans before opening the door. Mrs. Carter sat behind her desk, warm sunlight streaming through the window behind her. Loki lay at her feet, his head rising immediately as Max entered. The dog's eyes locked onto him, making Max's stomach twist. "Have a seat, Max," Mrs. Carter said kindly, gesturing to the chair across from her. "How are you doing today?" Max carefully lowered himself into the chair, trying not to wince as his bruised ribs protested. "I'm fine," he said, keeping his voice steady. He'd practiced this response countless times in front of his bedroom mirror. "I wanted to check in with you after everything that's happened," she continued, her voice gentle. "Is there anything going on at home that you'd like to talk about?" Max's throat tightened. He forced his face to stay neutral, the way he always did when Greg questioned him. "No, everything's fine at home. Normal." "Those were some nasty bruises you were treating," Mrs. Carter observed. "That must have been quite a fall from your skateboard." "Yeah, I'm not very good at it yet," Max replied, the lie falling easily from his lips. "I should probably wear more padding." Loki suddenly stood up, his movement drawing both their attention. The German shepherd's ears pointed forward, his brown eyes fixed intently on Max's face. There was something about that stare, like the dog could see right through him. Max shifted in his chair, his fingers picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He couldn't meet those eyes. They reminded him too much of how his mother used to look at him, before she stopped looking at all. Mrs. Carter watched this interaction carefully, her pen tapping quietly against her notepad. "You know, Max, my door is always open if you ever need to talk about anything." "Thanks," Max mumbled, relief flooding through him as she didn't press further. "Can I go back to class now?" She nodded, and Max practically bolted from his chair. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard voices around the corner. Why does the school even keep that dog? It attacked a student. The voice was sharp with judgment. "I heard they might get rid of it," another student replied. Max froze mid-step, an unexpected wave of emotion washing over him. Loki hadn't attacked him. The dog had been trying to help. In fact, Loki was the only one who seemed to really see past his careful mask, past all his practiced lies. He stood there, wrestling with the knowledge that because of him, because of his secrets, they might take away the one being who actually noticed his pain. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Max walked home from school, each step slower than the last. His backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down by more than just books. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder, the feeling of being watched making his skin crawl. Loki's intense stare had left him rattled, like someone had finally pulled back the curtain he'd worked so hard to keep closed. The house loomed ahead, quiet and still. Max's hand trembled slightly as he turned the key in the lock. The familiar click seemed louder than usual in the silence. He stepped inside, hoping to slip upstairs unnoticed. "What happened at school?" Greg's voice sliced through the air like a knife. Max's heart stuttered. His stepfather sat in his armchair, newspaper folded in his lap, eyes cold and calculating. Before Max could respond, Greg crossed the room in 3 quick strides. His fingers wrapped around Max's wrist, squeezing until the bones ground together. "Got an interesting call from one of your teachers today. Something about you visiting the counselor's office." Max kept his face carefully blank, even as pain shot up his arm. He'd learned long ago that showing fear only made things worse. "It was just about my grades," he said, the lie smooth and practiced. "They're worried about my math scores." From the kitchen came the quiet clink of dishes being washed. Max's eyes darted to where his mother stood at the sink, her back rigid, hands shaking as she scrubbed the same plate over and over. She must have felt his gaze because she turned slightly, their eyes meeting for just a moment. In that brief connection, Max saw what he always saw: fear, guilt, and helplessness. Then she looked away, like she always did, leaving him alone again. Greg's grip loosened, but his eyes remained hard. "No more screw-ups," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "You don't want to disappoint your mother, do you?" The threat hung in the air, clear as day. Max shook his head, relief flooding through him as Greg finally released his wrist. Later that night, Max lay in his bed, staring at the shadows dancing across his ceiling. His wrist throbbed where Greg had grabbed him, but he knew better than to ice it. The pain would fade by morning, just like always. As he shifted position, trying to find comfort, Loki's face flashed through his mind. Those knowing eyes, filled with such certainty and concern, had seen right through him. No one had ever looked at him quite like that before. Max rolled onto his side, wrapping his arms around himself. A small, dangerous thought crept into his mind. If he let Loki in, if he stopped fighting so hard to keep his walls up, would anything change? The question hung in the darkness, unanswered and terrifying. The morning light streamed through the school's windows as Mrs. Carter made her rounds, clipboard in hand. Loki padded beside her, but something was off about his usual calm demeanor. His muscles were taut, his eyes constantly scanning the hallways. When she tried to lead him toward the cafeteria for morning check-ins, he planted his feet firmly, refusing to move. "Loki, come on," she said softly, giving his leash a gentle tug. But the German shepherd wouldn't budge. Then Max entered the hallway, and everything changed. Loki's entire body went rigid. His ears pricked forward, and his tail stiffened like a rod. Mrs. Carter quickly jotted down notes about Loki's reaction, adding it to her growing list of observations. Every time Max was nearby, Loki showed the same signs: ears pulled back, tail stiff, a deep rumbling growl in his throat. It wasn't aggression. It was distress. During lunch period, Max sat with his friends, forcing out laughs that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told jokes he didn't feel, smiled when he wanted to cry. His long-sleeve shirt covered most of the bruises, but moving hurt. Each breath sent sharp pains through his ribs. In gym class, Max lingered until most of the other boys had finished changing. He quickly pulled off his shirt, hoping no one would notice. "Dude, what happened?" Max's heart stopped. Tommy, a boy from his math class, was staring at the dark purple bruise that spread across his ribs like spilled ink. "Oh, this?" Max forced a casual tone, pulling his gym shirt on fast. "Wiped out on my skateboard. Hit the rail pretty hard." He even managed a sheepish grin. Tommy nodded, already losing interest. "That's rough, man. You should be more careful." But across the hall, Loki's ears twitched at the lie. The dog had been passing by with Mrs. Carter when he heard Max's voice. His head turned sharply toward the locker room. That afternoon, during English class, Max tried to focus on The Great Gatsby while his teacher discussed symbolism. The pain in his ribs made it hard to concentrate. Suddenly, the classroom door pushed open. Loki had slipped away from Mrs. Carter again, but this time there was no barking, no lunging. The German Shepherd walked straight to Max's desk, his nails clicking softly on the linoleum floor. With gentle determination, he placed his head in Max's lap and let out a soft, mournful whine. Max's hands clenched into fists under his desk. His jaw tightened as he stared straight ahead, trying to ignore the warm weight of Loki's head, the concerned eyes that seemed to see right through every wall he'd built. He wouldn't break, not yet. Max spent the entire day dodging corners and taking alternate routes through the school hallways. Every time he spotted Loki's black and tan fur, he'd turn around or duck into a classroom. But the German Shepherd seemed to have a sixth sense about his location. Whenever Max thought he was safe, there would be Loki watching him with those intense brown eyes. By the final bell, Max's nerves were frayed. He rushed toward the exit, backpack clutched tight against his aching ribs. But Mrs. Carter's gentle voice stopped him. "Max? Could we talk for a moment?" His heart pounded as he followed her to her office. Loki trailed behind them, his nails clicking softly on the floor. Inside, Mrs. Carter didn't sit behind her desk like most teachers would. Instead, she pulled up two comfortable chairs, making the space feel less formal. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Why do you think Loki is so focused on you?" Max shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the carpet. "I don't know," he mumbled. "Maybe he just doesn't like me." Mrs. Carter smiled softly. "That's not how Loki works. In all his years here, he's never shown this kind of attention to anyone." When Max didn't respond, she continued, "I'm not trying to trap you or force you to say anything. I just want you to know that if you ever need help, you can tell me." She gestured to Loki, who sat attentively beside them. "And Loki? He'll always be there." Something in her tone made Max look up. There was no suspicion in her eyes, no accusation. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't feel like he was being interrogated. The knot in his chest loosened just a little. That night, Max lay in bed, his phone clutched in his hand. He'd pulled up Mrs. Carter's contact information from the school directory 3 times already. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard. "I need to tell you something." Delete. "Can we talk tomorrow?" Delete. "I don't know what to do." Delete. The house creaked around him as night settled in. Then his stepfather's voice carried through the walls, low and menacing. Max could picture Greg's face, the way his eyes got dark when he was angry. His mother's voice followed, barely above a whisper, trying to calm him down. Max pulled his pillow over his head, squeezing his eyes shut. He tried to block out the sounds, tried not to think about what might happen. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Loki staring back at him, those knowing eyes filled with understanding and concern. The next day, Max sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, pushing his food around with a plastic fork. His body felt heavy, like he was moving through water. The bruise on his side throbbed with each breath, a constant reminder of last night's conversation with Greg. Through the drone of lunch hour chatter, a conversation at the next table caught his attention. "Did you hear? They're having a school board meeting about that dog," a girl said, leaning in close to her friends. "About Loki? Why?" another student asked. "Because he attacked that kid, remember? My mom's on the board and she says they're thinking about removing him from the school." Max's fork clattered against his tray. The bite of sandwich in his mouth turned to ash. This was his fault. All of it. Because he couldn't handle things on his own. Because he was weak. Loki might lose his home. Across the cafeteria, he spotted Mrs. Carter at her usual lunch spot. Loki lay beside her chair, his head resting on his paws. But even from this distance, Max could feel those eyes on him, always watching, always knowing. A memory flashed through his mind. Greg's face last night twisted with rage over a simple question about dinner. Max's mother standing in the corner, silent as always. The familiar feeling of being completely alone. But was he? Those brown eyes hadn't left him alone for days. Loki had seen something in him that no one else had bothered to notice. The dog had tried again and again to help, even when Max pushed him away. And now, because of Max's silence, Loki might be forced to leave. For the first time, Max wondered if having someone watch over him, someone who actually cared, wasn't such a terrible thing after all. That night, Max lay in bed, his phone screen casting a blue glow across his face. His fingers trembled as he pulled up Mrs. Carter's contact information. The cursor blinked in the empty message field, waiting. Max typed, deleted, and typed again. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Finally, after what felt like hours, he wrote, "If I told you something, would you promise not to tell my mom?" His thumb hovered over the send button. The house was quiet for once. Greg had gone out with friends, and his mom was probably already asleep. In the stillness, Max could hear his own ragged breathing. He pressed send. Mrs. Carter sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone screen. Max's message glowed in the dim light. "If I told you something, would you promise not to tell my mom?" Her heart squeezed. After days of watching Loki's behavior, after countless worried nights, finally, a crack in the wall. She chose her words carefully, typing and retyping her response several times. The wrong words now could shut him down completely. Finally, she wrote, "Whatever it is, you're not alone. And I won't tell your mom if you don't want me to. But if you're in danger, I want to help." The message showed as delivered, but no response came. 1 hour passed, then 2. Mrs. Carter kept checking her phone, hoping to see those 3 dots appear, indicating Max was typing. But the screen remained silent. The next morning at school, Loki's behavior was more intense than ever. The German shepherd's eyes tracked Max's every movement through the hallways. When Max passed by them between classes, Loki pressed his body against the boy's leg, refusing to move until Max had to step around him. Mrs. Carter observed it all, taking mental notes. The way Max flinched when someone moved too quickly near him. How he kept his arms wrapped around his middle, as if protecting himself. The dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. During lunch break, Max appeared at her office door. His hands were stuffed deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. He glanced down the hallway both ways before stepping inside. He started, then stopped, swallowed hard. I wanted to explain about Loki. Mrs. Carter waited patiently, keeping her expression open and calm. Loki sat up straighter, his eyes fixed on Max. I've been getting hurt at home, Max said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. That's why he won't leave me alone. He can tell, I guess. Mrs. Carter kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Are you safe at home, Max? The question seemed to snap something shut in Max. He stepped back, shaking his head. I'm fine, he muttered, already turning toward the door. I just wanted you to know why Loki's been acting weird. That's all. Before Mrs. Carter could say another word, Max was gone, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. She watched him disappear around the corner, her chest tight with concern. Beside her, Loki whined softly, his ears pricked forward in the direction Max had gone. She knew there was more to the story, so much more that Max wasn't ready to say. But watching Loki's determined stance, she also knew something else. Loki wouldn't let this go. Max trudged up the driveway, his backpack feeling heavier than usual. The conversation with Mrs. Carter had left him drained, and all he wanted was to disappear into his room. But as soon as he opened the front door, he knew something was wrong. Greg stood in the hallway, his arms crossed. The familiar cold smile spread across his face. Got an interesting call from school today again. Max's stomach dropped. He tried to keep his voice steady. Oh? The counselor's office. Greg took a step forward. Care to explain why you were there? Max said quickly. They're worried about... Greg moved so fast Max didn't have time to react. Rough hands grabbed his collar, slamming him against the wall. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Don't lie to me, Greg hissed, his face inches from Max. What did you tell them? Nothing. I swear. Max's voice cracked. They just wanted to talk about... Greg's grip tightened. About what? From the kitchen doorway came the soft sound of crying. Max's mother stood there, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But she didn't move. She never did. I didn't, Max started, but Greg cut him off by throwing him to the ground. Pain exploded through his ribs as he hit the hardwood floor. He curled in on himself, trying to protect his middle, knowing what was coming. Greg's foot connected with his side. Once, twice. Max didn't cry out. He'd learned long ago that making noise only made things worse. So he stayed silent, waiting for it to end, focusing on breathing through the pain. Later, lying in his bed, Max stared at the dark ceiling. Every breath sent sharp pains through his chest. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the room. It was Mrs. Carter. I want to check in on you. Are you okay? Max's trembling fingers hovered over the screen. He'd never told anyone before, never reached out, never asked for help. But now, in the darkness of his room, with his ribs screaming and his mother's silent tears haunting him, something shifted inside him. Slowly, painfully, he typed his response. Max shuffled through the school hallway the next morning, each step sending sharp jolts through his ribs. He had wrapped them as best he could with an old ace bandage, but the pain still made his eyes water. He kept his face carefully blank, the way he always did when things got bad. But some people couldn't be fooled. Mrs. Carter noticed immediately how Max moved differently, slower, stiffer, like every movement hurt. She watched him from her office doorway, her heart sinking as he made his way to class. Beside her, Loki's reaction was even more dramatic. The moment Max passed by, the German shepherd's ears flattened against his head, and a low whine escaped his throat. His eyes never left Max's retreating form. In Max's first period class, everything seemed normal at first. The teacher wrote equations on the board while students copied them down. Max sat near the back, trying to find a position that didn't make his ribs scream. Then it happened. Loki, who had been lying quietly in the hallway outside, suddenly lifted his head. His nose twitched, and without warning, he pushed through the partially open door and barked, loud and sharp. The classroom froze. Pencils stopped scratching. Heads snapped up. Even the teacher stood speechless, chalk suspended mid-equation. Loki had never, not once in his entire time at the school, barked during class. The dog's eyes were locked on Max, his body rigid with tension. Another bark echoed through the silent room. Mrs. Carter burst through the door seconds later, her face flushed. "I'm so sorry," she started, but Loki barked again, taking a step toward Max. "He's probably just hungry," Max said quickly, forcing a laugh that made his ribs burn. "Right, boy?" But Loki wasn't playing. He barked again and again, each sound more urgent than the last. Later that afternoon, the principal's office was packed. Parents who'd heard about the incident sat in chairs along the wall, their faces concerned. The school board representative looked grave. Mrs. Carter stood at the front of the room, Loki sitting calmly at her feet, as if he hadn't caused chaos just hours before. "This behavior is unacceptable," one parent said. "What if he becomes aggressive?" "He's clearly becoming unpredictable," another added. "We can't risk our children's safety." Mrs. Carter took a deep breath, her hand resting on Loki's head. "Loki isn't the problem," she said firmly. "He's trying to tell us something." The principal leaned forward in his chair. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Carter met his eyes steadily. "I think he's protecting one of our students." Max huddled in the last bathroom stall, his arms wrapped tightly around his middle. Each breath felt like fire in his chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making his head spin even more than it already was. He hadn't slept more than an hour last night. Every time he'd tried to lie down, the pain in his ribs had jolted him awake. Now, sitting on the closed toilet lid, he could barely keep his eyes open. "Just need a minute," he mumbled to himself, but his words came out slurred. The bathroom tiles seemed to shift under his feet, making his stomach turn. He pressed his forehead against the cool metal wall of the stall, trying to ground himself. The pain in his ribs pulsed with each heartbeat. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He knew this wasn't good, knew he should probably tell someone, but his thoughts kept slipping away, like water through his fingers. The voices from the hallway started to sound distant, as if they were coming from underwater. Max tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The stall walls tilted sideways. Then, cutting through the fog in his brain, came a sharp, familiar sound. A bark. Loki. The German shepherd's nails clicked against the tile floor outside, followed by frantic scratching at the bathroom door. His barks grew louder, more desperate. He growled, then barked again, the sound echoing off the bathroom walls. Students gathered in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Loki's paws scraped against the door as he whined, high and distressed. Mrs. Carter's footsteps pounded down the hall. "Loki, what is it?" The bathroom door creaked open as a student pushed it. Max lay crumpled on the floor, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Loki rushed to his side, whimpering. Mrs. Carter dropped to her knees beside him. "Max? Max, can you hear me?" He tried to focus on her face, but everything kept fading in and out. The last thing he saw was Loki's worried brown eyes, and Mrs. Carter's frightened expression as she called his name. Then darkness swallowed everything. The steady beeping of a hospital monitor pulled Max from the darkness. His eyelids felt heavy as he blinked, trying to focus on the white ceiling above him. Everything hurt, his ribs especially, and his thoughts came slowly, like wading through mud. Where was he? The antiseptic smell and the scratchy sheets against his skin gave him his answer before memory did. Hospital. Then it all rushed back. The bathroom, not being able to breathe. Loki's frantic barking. Mrs. Carter's voice. A dull ache throbbed through his entire body. Even the simple act of turning his head made him wince. The room was small but bright, with sunlight streaming through half-closed blinds. An IV drip stood beside his bed, the clear tube running down to his arm. The door opened and a nurse in blue scrubs entered, clipboard in hand. She smiled warmly when she saw Max was awake. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, checking the monitors beside his bed. Before Max could answer, the door swung open again. His mother hurried in, her face pinched with worry. Behind her, Greg's tall figure filled the doorway. Max's stomach clenched as his stepfather's eyes met his, calm on the surface, but with that familiar cold warning underneath. "The doctor will be in shortly," the nurse said, adjusting something on Max's IV. "He collapsed from exhaustion and stress, but we're also concerned about some injuries we found during examination." Greg stepped forward smoothly, his voice carrying that perfect mix of concern and casual explanation that always fooled everyone. "He's always been clumsy," he said, shaking his head. "Took a bad fall last week. We told him to be more careful on that skateboard." The nurse glanced at Max's chart, her forehead creasing slightly. These injuries seemed quite extensive for a skateboarding accident. "Boys will be boys," Greg cut in, his tone still pleasant but firm. "Always getting into something, aren't they?" Max stared down at the hospital blanket, his fingers clutching the thin fabric. He could feel his mother's nervous energy, see her wringing her hands from the corner of his eye. The familiar weight of silence pressed down on his chest, heavier than any bruise. Through the window in the door, he caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. Mrs. Carter had arrived, her face concerned as she spoke to someone at the nurse's station. His heart leaped for a moment, but then sank as the nurse shook her head, clearly denying her entry. Greg noticed Max's attention drift to the door. He leaned down close, his breath hot against Max's ear. "If I hear you've been running your mouth," he whispered, too low for anyone else to hear, "you'll regret it." Max nodded slightly, his throat too tight to speak. He knew exactly what that meant. The threat hung in the air between them, as real as the IV in his arm. The morning after Max's hospitalization, tension filled the school hallways. Parents gathered in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Mrs. Carter could feel their stares as she walked past, could hear snippets of their worried conversations. That dog could have seriously hurt someone. What if he attacks another student? It's just not safe. Her office phone rang just before first period. It was the principal's secretary requesting her immediate presence in the main office. Mrs. Carter's stomach tightened as she made her way there, already knowing what this was about. The principal sat behind his desk, looking tired. Several angry emails from parents were open on his computer screen. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "This isn't Loki's fault," Mrs. Carter began, but the principal held up his hand. "The school board called an emergency meeting this morning," he explained. "They're very concerned about liability issues." The meeting room was packed when they arrived. School board members sat at their usual places, while worried parents filled the visitor seats. Mrs. Carter noticed some familiar faces. Parents who had never liked the idea of a service dog in school, now wearing expressions of vindication. "The dog lunged at a student," one board member stated firmly. "He's disrupted multiple classes. This can't continue." "Loki didn't attack Max," Mrs. Carter argued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He was trying to help him. He knew something was wrong before any of us did. And he was right. Max collapsed yesterday." But we have no proof of why he collapsed, another member countered. And without concrete evidence of abuse, we can't justify keeping a potentially dangerous animal in school. Loki isn't dangerous. He's trained specifically to detect emotional distress. He was doing his job. The debate continued for nearly an hour, but Mrs. Carter could see the decision had already been made. The vote was quick and decisive. Loki would be removed from the school immediately. That evening, as the halls emptied and the sun began to set, a temporary handler arrived with a transport carrier. Mrs. Carter knelt beside Loki, running her hands through his thick fur one last time. The German shepherd seemed to sense what was happening. His ears were flat against his head, his brown eyes filled with confusion. As the handler attached a new leash to Loki's collar, the dog began to whine. He pulled against the restraint, trying to stay close to Mrs. Carter. Each step toward the exit was a struggle, Loki looking back at her repeatedly. Mrs. Carter felt tears burning in her eyes as she watched him being led away. She leaned down close to his ear, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll fix this. I swear." The ride home from the hospital was silent. Max sat in the back seat, each bump in the road sending waves of pain through his body. His mother kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror while Greg drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When they arrived home, his mother helped him up the stairs to his room. Her touch was gentle but hesitant, like she was afraid of leaving marks. Max noticed how she avoided looking directly at him. "Do you need anything?" she whispered, hovering by his doorway. Max shook his head. She nodded and closed the door, her footsteps fading as she went back downstairs. Through the floor, he could hear Greg in the kitchen, cabinet doors slamming shut with increasing force. The house felt different now, heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Max lay on his bed, trying not to move too much, listening to the sounds below. Hours passed. The sun set. Max's mother called him down for dinner, but he said he wasn't hungry. More hours ticked by, and Max thought maybe, just maybe, the night would pass quietly. Then Greg's heavy footsteps came up the stairs. The door burst open. Greg's face was red, his eyes wild. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled. "Getting that mutt worked up, making the school ask questions." "I didn't," Max started, but Greg cut him off. "Shut up!" Greg's voice rose. "You're causing problems, making your mother worry, making people dig where they shouldn't." He grabbed Max's arm, yanking him up. "You ungrateful little—" Greg shoved him hard. Max stumbled backward, his hip catching the edge of his desk. Pain exploded through his already injured ribs. He gasped, doubling over. His mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Greg, please." "Stay out of this," Greg snapped. She stepped back, wringing her hands. Just like always, watching, never helping. In that moment, something inside Max broke. A realization hit him like ice water. No one was coming to save him. His mother wouldn't stop this. The doctors hadn't noticed. The teachers looked the other way. No one except Loki. The dog had been the only one who saw the truth. The only one who tried to help again and again, until they took him away. Later that night, after Greg had stormed out and the house had gone quiet, Max pulled out his phone. His hands trembled as he opened his messages to Mrs. Carter. He stared at the screen for a long time. His fingers hovered over the keys. If he did this, there was no going back. Finally, he typed, "I need help." The response came immediately. "Where are you?" "I'm coming." In the temporary shelter on the outskirts of town, Loki paced back and forth in his kennel. His nails clicked against the concrete floor in an endless rhythm. The handler, Sarah, watched him with growing concern as she made her evening rounds. "Still not eating, big guy?" She crouched by his food bowl, which remained untouched since morning. Loki didn't even glance at it. His eyes stayed fixed on the distance, his ears twitching at every sound. Sarah had worked with service dogs for years, but she'd never seen one this distressed. Loki barely slept, spending hours standing alert or pacing. His training should have kept him calm, but something stronger than training drove him now. As Sarah turned to check on other dogs, Loki's behavior suddenly changed. His body tensed, head snapping up as if hearing something far away. Before Sarah could react, he launched himself at the kennel door. The latch, worn from years of use, gave way under his weight. Sarah lunged to grab him, but Loki was already running, faster than she'd ever seen a dog move. "Loki, stop!" she called, but he disappeared into the gathering darkness. Guided by instinct and memory, Loki raced through the city streets. His paws pounded against concrete and asphalt as he weaved through traffic. Cars honked, people shouted, but nothing slowed him down. He had one purpose, one destination burned into his mind. He sprinted through a park, past startled joggers, following a scent trail only he could detect. Each turn, each crossing, brought him closer to Max. His training told him to stop, to wait for commands, but something deeper pushed him forward. Max lay curled up on his bed, trying not to move. Every breath sent sharp pains through his chest. The house had gone quiet after Greg's latest outburst, but the silence felt dangerous, like a storm about to break. Then he heard it, a scratching sound outside. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but it grew louder, more insistent. Then came a sound that made his heart skip, a familiar bark. "Loki?" he whispered. Downstairs, Greg's chair scraped against the floor. "What the hell?" The scratching intensified, accompanied by urgent whining. Then, in the distance, another sound cut through the night. Police sirens, growing closer. Greg's footsteps thundered up the stairs. "What did you do?" he demanded, bursting into Max's room. But before he could reach Max, the front door crashed open downstairs. Paws scrambled on hardwood floors, racing up the stairs. Greg turned toward the doorway just as Loki appeared, his fur bristling, teeth bared. The German Shepherd planted himself firmly between Max and Greg, a low, threatening growl rumbling in his chest. Greg took a step back, his face draining of color. For the first time, Max saw real fear in his stepfather's eyes as he faced the protective wall of muscle and teeth that was Loki. The police sirens were right outside now, red and blue lights flashing through the windows. Mrs. Carter had kept her promise. Help was finally here. The pounding on the front door echoed through the house like thunder. Greg stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, as red and blue lights painted shifting patterns across the walls. Max remained curled up on the floor, his mind struggling to process the rapid turn of events. Loki's steady growl filled the space between them, his body a protective barrier between the boy and his tormentor. "Police! Open up!" The voice outside was firm, authoritative. Greg's expression shifted, a calculated smoothness replacing his shock. He straightened his shirt, cleared his throat, and headed downstairs. Loki's eyes tracked his every movement, but the dog didn't budge from Max's side. The front door creaked open. "What's this about, officers?" Greg's voice dripped with fake concern and confusion. But the lead officer's attention immediately went past him, drawn to the German Shepherd's defensive stance at the top of the stairs and the bruised teenager behind him. "Let us in, sir." It wasn't a request. Mrs. Carter's voice cut through the tension. "Check Max." She stood behind the officers, her face set with determination. "Now wait just a minute," Greg started, but the officers were already moving past him. One of them, a female officer with kind eyes, carefully approached Max. Loki assessed her briefly before allowing her closer, though he remained alert. She knelt beside Max, keeping her movements slow and gentle. "Son, did someone hurt you?" Max's throat tightened. His eyes darted to Greg, catching the silent threat in his stepfather's glare. The familiar fear crept in, the urge to lie, to protect himself from what would come later. His mouth opened, ready to deny everything. Then he felt it, a soft, warm touch against his hand. Loki's nose pressed gently into his palm, grounding him in the moment. The dog's presence reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore. Max took a shaky breath. "Yes." The word hung in the air, small but powerful. Years of silence broken by a single syllable. Greg's face contorted. "He's lying." The boy's always been clumsy, always getting into accidents. "Show them," Mrs. Carter said softly to Max. With trembling fingers, Max lifted his shirt. The officers drew in sharp breaths at the sight of his torso, a canvas of purple, yellow, and green bruises in various stages of healing, some fresh, others fading, telling a story of ongoing abuse that no one could deny. The lead officer turned to Greg, his expression hardening. "Turn around, sir. Put your hands behind your back." "This is ridiculous," Greg protested as the handcuffs clicked into place. "You can't just—" "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, leading Greg toward the stairs. Max's mother stood in the corner, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't move, didn't speak, as her husband was led away. Max watched through the window as Greg was placed in the police car, still arguing loudly. The fear that had been his constant companion for so long began to fade, replaced by something new: relief. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital examination room, Max sat quietly as doctors carefully documented every mark on his body. Each touch made him wince, not just from pain, but from the memory of how each injury occurred. The doctor's pen scratched against his clipboard, recording the evidence of years of abuse that could no longer be hidden. "Multiple contusions in various stages of healing," the doctor murmured, gently pressing along Max's ribcage. "At least 2 cracked ribs, possibly 3. He shook his head, exchanging glances with the nurse. "We'll need x-rays to confirm the extent." From the corner of the room, a second doctor spoke in hushed tones about contacting child services. The words floated around Max like distant echoes, not quite reaching him through the fog of exhaustion and relief. Mrs. Carter sat in a chair nearby, her presence steady and reassuring. She didn't hover or try to fill the silence with empty words. She was just there, a quiet anchor in the storm. After the doctors finished their examination and left to process their findings, Max found himself wanting to talk. The words that had been trapped inside him for so long suddenly needed to escape. "It started small," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "After Mom married Greg, just yelling at first, then pushing, then—" His voice trailed off. Mrs. Carter didn't interrupt or try to finish his sentences. She simply listened, her face calm and attentive. "Mom would see it happening," Max continued, his voice growing stronger. "She'd just leave the room, like if she didn't watch, it wasn't real." He twisted the edge of the hospital blanket between his fingers. "I started believing maybe I deserved it. Maybe I really was as worthless as he said." Mrs. Carter's eyes held understanding without pity. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it would all be okay. She just let him speak his truth, finally free from the weight of secrecy. The social worker arrived as evening approached, carrying a folder thick with paperwork. She explained things in a gentle but matter-of-fact way. Max wouldn't be going home. He would be placed in temporary foster care while the investigation continued. The word should have terrified him. A new place, strangers, more uncertainty. But instead, one thought kept repeating in his mind: I don't have to go back. For the first time in years, Max took a deep breath. His ribs ached, but the pain felt different now. It wasn't a reminder of fear and helplessness anymore. Each breath was a reminder that he was free. Max stood in the doorway of his new temporary home, clutching his backpack like a shield. The house was modest, but well kept, with cheerful yellow curtains and family photos lining the walls. John and Maria Thompson, his foster parents, kept their distance as they showed him around, sensing his need for space. Your room is upstairs, second door on the right, Maria said softly. We put fresh sheets on the bed and cleared out the dresser for your things. Max nodded without speaking. He wasn't used to this kind of careful consideration. In his old house, his room had been a place to hide, not a space that belonged to him. The room was simple, a twin bed with blue covers, a wooden dresser, and a small desk by the window. Nothing special, but it felt safe. Max set his backpack down carefully, his movements measured and cautious. Dinner's at 6, John mentioned from the doorway. But no pressure if you're not hungry. We can save you a plate. Max nodded again, throat tight. Their kindness felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. He didn't know how to respond to it. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Max's thoughts drifted to Loki. He missed the German Shepherd's steady presence, those knowing eyes that had seen right through his carefully constructed walls. The dog had been the first one to really see him, to refuse to look away from his pain. The next day, Max attended his first therapy session. The office was painted in calm blues and greens, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. His therapist, Dr. Reynolds, didn't push him to talk. She just sat quietly, letting him take in the space. What would you like to do first, Max? She asked after a while. It can be anything. Max looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. I want to see Loki, he said without hesitation. His voice was quiet, but certain. Dr. Reynolds smiled gently. You miss him. He knew, Max said, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Before anyone else knew. He just knew. Back at the Thompsons, Max tried to settle into a routine. Maria always left breakfast on the table, never commenting when he ate alone. John gave him space but stayed nearby, a steady presence that didn't demand anything from him. One evening, as Max sat doing homework at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed. Mrs. Carter's name appeared on the screen. Come to the school tomorrow, she said simply. Max's heart jumped. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He just hoped. That night, sleep came easier than it had in days. Tomorrow, he would go to school, and maybe, just maybe, he would see those knowing eyes again. Max stood at the entrance of his old school, his heart pounding against his ribs. The building looked different now, less threatening, but still filled with memories. Mrs. Carter waited by the front steps, her familiar warm smile greeting him from across the yard. Then a sound split the morning air, a sharp, excited bark that made Max's chest tighten with emotion. Before he could even turn toward it, a blur of brown and black fur bounded across the schoolyard. Loki ran full speed, his paws barely touching the ground, ears perked forward and eyes locked on Max. The German Shepherd crashed into Max with such enthusiasm that Max stumbled backward, landing softly on the grass. Loki's tail wagged so hard his entire body shook as he covered Max's face with eager licks. The dog's warmth and weight felt like coming home. And then something extraordinary happened, Max laughed. Not the careful, measured laugh he'd used to deflect attention, but a real, full-bodied laugh that bubbled up from deep in his chest. The sound surprised him, bright and clear in the morning air. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Mrs. Carter watched them, her eyes twinkling. She walked over slowly, giving them their moment. When Max finally managed to sit up, still scratching behind Loki's ears, she cleared her throat. "I have some news," she said, her voice gentle but excited. "Loki isn't the school's dog anymore." She paused, her smile growing wider. "He's yours." Max's hands froze in Loki's fur. He stared at Mrs. Carter, certain he'd misheard. But she nodded, confirming what seemed impossible. The tears came. Before Max could stop them, hot and sudden. He buried his face in Loki's thick fur, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. Loki stayed perfectly still, letting Max hold on as tight as he needed to. And this time, Max knew he wouldn't have to let go. Days later, Max sat at the kitchen table in his foster home, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. The smell of fresh coffee and toast filled the air, so different from the tense silence of his old house. John read the morning paper while Maria hummed softly by the stove. Everything felt normal, and that's what made it so strange. Loki lay at Max's feet, his warm presence a constant comfort. When Maria accidentally dropped a pan, making a loud clang, Max flinched hard. But before the panic could set in, Loki pressed against his leg, grounding him in the present moment. At night, the old fears crept back. Max would jolt awake, his heart racing, convinced he heard Greg's footsteps in the hall. But instead of cold darkness, he'd feel Loki's gentle weight beside him. The dog would nuzzle his hand, offering silent comfort until his breathing steadied. In therapy, Max sat stiffly on the worn leather couch. Dr. Sanders waited patiently as he struggled to find words. Loki rested his head on Max's knee, a steady warmth that made talking just a little easier. "I keep thinking about my mom," Max finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She saw everything. She knew what was happening." Dr. Sanders nodded encouragingly. That must have hurt deeply. "I wanted her to stop him." Max's hands clenched in Loki's fur. "Just once. I wanted her to say something, do something, but she never did." Tears burned in his eyes, but he blinked them back. Old habits died hard. "She was supposed to protect me," he continued, the words spilling out now. "Isn't that what moms are supposed to do?" Dr. Sanders leaned forward slightly. "Yes, they are. You deserved to be protected." Max fell silent, processing this simple truth. After a moment, "Doctor," Sanders asked gently, "would you want to talk to her?" The question hung in the air. Max stroked Loki's ears, thinking. "I don't know," he admitted finally. That evening, Max sat in the backyard of his foster home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Loki lay beside him, head resting heavily on his lap. The weight felt comforting, anchoring. For the first time since everything happened, Max let himself think about what came next. Not just tomorrow or next week, but months from now. Years even. The future had always felt like a dark, threatening thing, something to survive rather than look forward to. But now, with Loki's steady presence beside him and the knowledge that he was finally safe, Max felt something new stirring in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the caseworker's office as Max sat rigid in the plastic chair. Loki pressed against his leg, sensing his anxiety. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into eternity. When the door opened, Max's breath caught in his throat. His mother walked in, and something inside him twisted. She looked different somehow, smaller, frailer than he remembered. Her hands fidgeted with her purse strap as she took the seat across from him. "Hi, Max," she said softly, her voice wavering. Max couldn't speak. He just nodded, his hand buried in Loki's fur for comfort. The caseworker sat quietly in the corner, observing but giving them space. I'm so sorry," his mother began, tears already forming in her eyes. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared, and I failed you. But I want you to know I love you. I've always loved you." Max felt emotions surge through him, anger, hurt, frustration. His chest tightened with all the words he'd wanted to say for years. He wanted to scream at her, to ask how she could watch him suffer day after day, how she could hear his cries and do nothing, how love could be so passive, so weak. Instead, what came out was barely a whisper. "I needed you." The words hung in the air between them. His mother's tears fell freely now, and she nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Will you—" She hesitated, wiping her cheeks. "Will you ever come back home?" Max looked down at Loki, who sat alert and protective beside him. The dog had done more to save him than his own mother ever had. The answer came easily, with a certainty that surprised him. No. One simple word, but it carried the weight of years of pain and the promise of a different future. His mother nodded slowly, accepting the finality in his voice. Max stood up, Loki rising immediately with him. Without another word, he walked out of the office, each step taking him further from his past and closer to a future that, for the first time, felt like his own. The seasons changed, and with them, Max's life transformed. Fall turned to winter, then spring bloomed into summer. In his foster home with John and Maria, Max discovered what family could really mean. They never demanded he share his feelings, but they showed up, sitting quietly in therapy, waiting rooms, attending his school events, or simply being there when he needed someone to listen. John taught him how to change a tire one weekend, explaining each step with patience. Maria always made sure there were fresh cookies when he came home from school. Small gestures, but they meant everything to Max. At his new school, Max slowly opened up. He joined the photography club, discovering he had an eye for capturing moments others missed. He made real friends, kids who liked him for who he was, not because they pitied him. They'd come over to study, and sometimes Max would catch himself laughing so hard his sides hurt, but this time, from joy. Through it all, Loki remained his constant companion. The German shepherd slept beside his bed, walked with him to school, and seemed to know exactly when Max needed extra comfort. One sunny afternoon in May, Max found himself back in his old school, but everything felt different. He stood at the front of a classroom, his hands steady as he held the microphone. Loki sat beside him, alert but calm, his presence grounding as always. "I didn't want help," Max began, his voice clear and strong. "I thought I could handle everything alone. But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone help you." He looked around at the sea of young faces watching him. Some reminded him of himself just months ago. Loki saw what I was trying to hide. When everyone else believed my excuses, he knew the truth. He wouldn't let me disappear. Max's hand found Loki's fur, drawing strength from the familiar touch. He kept showing up, kept trying to protect me, even when I pushed him away. The room was silent, every student focused on his words. Max shared parts of his story, not the darkest details, but enough to matter. He talked about fear, about feeling trapped, about thinking he was alone. But mostly he talked about hope, about how one dog's determination changed everything. A small hand rose from the middle of the room. A young student, maybe 12, looked at him with curious eyes. "So, does Loki still help you?" Max glanced down at his faithful companion. Loki's eyes met his, filled with that same unwavering loyalty that had saved his life. His tail wagged gently, and Max couldn't help but smile. "Every day." The morning sun painted golden streaks across Mac's bedroom floor as he opened his eyes. For once, he hadn't woken from nightmares, just the gentle weight of Loki shifting at the foot of his bed, ready for their daily walk. Max stretched, feeling unusually light, as if something heavy had finally lifted from his shoulders. He pulled on his favorite blue hoodie, not to hide anymore, but because the spring morning still carried a slight chill. Loki waited patiently by the door, leash in mouth, tail wagging with excitement. "Morning, you two," Maria called from the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the air. "Breakfast will be ready when you get back." Max nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. These morning routines had become precious to him. Simple, steady, safe. Outside, the neighborhood was just waking up. Birds chirped in the trees, and early joggers nodded friendly hellos as they passed. Max and Loki walked their usual route toward the park, their footsteps in perfect sync. The familiar path held no more shadows, no more fears of what waited at home. Because home, Max had learned, wasn't a place to dread anymore. His thoughts drifted to how far he'd come. The bruises had long since faded, but more importantly, so had the constant fear that had lived in his chest. It wasn't gone completely. His therapist said that was normal, but it no longer controlled him. As they entered the park, the morning dew still clinging to the grass, Loki suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his tail began to wag, and he sat down firmly, the same way he used to do with Max. That particular posture that meant he sensed someone needed help. Max followed Loki's gaze to a bench nearby. A boy, probably 12 or 13, sat alone, shoulders hunched, staring at the ground. Something about his posture struck a chord in Max. He recognized that look, that attempt to become invisible. Without hesitation, Max walked over, Loki padding softly beside him. The boy glanced up briefly, then back down, his body tensing slightly. Max knew that reaction too well, the instinct to prepare for the worst. Max sat down on the bench, leaving enough space to not seem threatening. Loki settled between them, his presence warm and reassuring. "Hey," Max said simply, his voice gentle. The boy looked up again, surprised by the casual greeting. His eyes darted between Max and Loki, uncertainty clear on his face. "That's Loki," Max continued, keeping his tone light. "He's pretty good at finding people who might need a friend." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly as Loki wagged his tail, offering that unconditional acceptance that only dogs seem capable of giving. Max felt Loki lean against his side, solid and steady, just as he had done so many times before. He took a deep breath, feeling the morning air fill his lungs. The park around them was peaceful, the sun climbing higher in the sky, and for the first time in his life, Max knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. If you enjoyed the story of Max and Loki, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.